People always thought I was just another quiet old man living out his days on a small ranch outside of town, tending to my crops, keeping to myself, but the truth was far from that. And the moment Karen from the HOA decided to set fire to my corn barn out of spite, she unleashed something she could never have imagined. Because I was not just any rancher or homeowner. I was a feared federal judge with decades of experience bringing down the most dangerous criminals in the country. And though I had stepped back from the chaos of the courts, I still held more power and connections than anyone in this neighborhood could even begin to fathom. So before I dive into how this story unfolded, let me just say this. Never underestimate someone who chooses peace over confrontation. Because behind that quiet demeanor might rest a storm you are completely unprepared to face. And if you want to hear the full weight of what happens when arrogance meets justice, stick around. Because this tale will take you from a petty HOA dispute to a courtroom reckoning that shook an entire community. And while you're here, don't forget to subscribe to Sham Stories so you never miss another unbelievable HOA drama that exposes the dark side of power and pride. It all began when I moved into this so-called idyllic suburban community after years of dealing with the worst of humanity from the bench. And I told myself I wanted peace, a little land, and a barn where I could grow corn as a hobby and stay grounded. But from the very first week, Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA board, made it clear she didn't like me, didn't like my independence, and didn't like the fact that I didn't bow to her ridiculous rules that seemed more about feeding her ego than improving the neighborhood. She came strutting up my driveway in her pressed blouse and clipboard in hand, telling me that my barn didn't conform to HOA standards, that my cornfield was an eyesore, and that if I wanted to live here, I'd have to respect the community's aesthetic, which was just. Her way of saying that she wanted everything under her thumb. I smiled, nodded, and told her that my barn was grandfathered in by property rights, and that my land had been here long before the HOA was ever formed. But Karen wasn't the type to let things go. She thrived on control and intimidation. And when she realized her usual bullying tactics wouldn't work on me, she decided to escalate. At first, it was small things, anonymous complaints about noise when I ran my tractor at reasonable hours, fines left in my mailbox, claiming violations that didn't exist, and even petty gossip spread around the neighborhood about me being suspicious or antisocial, but none of that bothered me, because I had spent years listening to hardened criminals and defense attorneys trying to twist the truth, and I wasn't about to be rattled by some suburban tyrant with too much time on her hands. But then, one summer night, everything changed. I had just gone inside after a long day of working in the fields when I smelled smoke, and by the time I ran back out, flames were already licking the side of my barn, the dry stalks of corn inside fueling the blaze like a tinderbox. And though I managed to grab a hose and call the fire department, the structure was beyond saving, collapsing in on itself as sparks flew into the night sky. My livelihood and my peace were consumed in that fire, and though the firefighters did their best, the barn was gone in less than an hour, reduced to charred beams and smoldering ash. Standing there watching it burn, I could hear the faint laughter of Karen from across the street, a smug expression on her face as if she thought she had finally broken me. But what she didn't realize was that by crossing that line, she had just handed me all the justification I needed to respond in the only way I knew how, through the law, through justice, and through consequences that would make her wish she had never targeted me in the first place. I didn't shout, I didn't threaten, I didn't even acknowledge her taunting. Instead, I calmly documented everything. Called in a few favors with local law enforcement to get the arson investigation rolling, and prepared to move forward in silence, because silence has always been the weapon of the powerful. The next morning, Karen strutted down the block as if nothing had happened, spreading rumors that my barn must have burned down because I was careless, that I probably left machinery running, or maybe stored something flammable inside without knowing what I was doing. And though some neighbors nodded along, others gave her skeptical looks, because they knew me as careful, precise, and meticulous. Still, Karen reveled in her moment of perceived victory, walking past me with a smirk and tossing off a comment about, "Maybe next time following the rules would have saved you some trouble," but I just smiled back and said nothing. because I had already seen the security footage from the camera I had installed near the barn. Footage that showed Karen sneaking across my yard in the dead of night, holding a gas can and striking a match. That was all I needed. One piece of undeniable evidence, and I knew the law would do the rest. But the story didn't end with simply catching her in the act. Because the deeper this went, the more tangled the web became. And soon it wasn't just about one vindictive neighbor, but about an HOA board complicit in her games. Neighbors who were too afraid to stand up to her, and a system that had allowed her to believe she was untouchable. What she didn't know was that I wasn't just any retired man with a bit of corn and a barn. I was Judge Alexander Kane, the man who had sentenced drug lords, mob bosses, and corrupt politicians 2 decades behind bars. The man whose reputation in the federal courts was one of being absolutely ruthless against liars and manipulators. And though I had never revealed that part of myself to this neighborhood, the time had come to remind people of who I really was. As I sat in my study that night, reviewing the footage and preparing my case, I knew this wouldn't just be about holding Karen accountable. This would be about dismantling her entire empire of intimidation. And by the time I was finished, there would be no doubt left in anyone's mind that justice, real justice, had come to this community. The morning after the fire, while the ashes of my barn were still warm and the faint smell of smoke hung over the fields, I walked calmly into the ruins with a camera in hand, taking careful pictures of everything. The blackened beams, the scorched earth, and the pattern of accelerant that any investigator would later recognize. Because I had no intention of letting emotion cloud my steps. I had spent decades making sure the guilty could not escape through technicalities. And I was not about to allow Karen to slip through my grasp now. But as I worked, neighbors trickled by. Some offering sympathetic words, others simply curious. And among them, I could see the unease spreading, because Karen had overplayed her hand, and her smug expression the night before had been noticed by more people than she realized. By midday, the local fire marshal had arrived, and I walked him through what I had seen and smelled the night the blaze started, careful not to mention my security footage just yet, because experience had taught me that timing was everything. And sometimes the best evidence had to be revealed at precisely the right moment for maximum impact. So I let him make his own observations. And sure enough, he found traces of accelerant, confirming my suspicion officially, and when he told me it was likely arson, I simply nodded. Though inside I felt the calm satisfaction of a chess player who had just positioned his queen perfectly for the kill. Karen, meanwhile, continued her little theater, marching around the cul-de-sac with her clipboard as though nothing unusual had happened, pretending to be busy with community matters, but I caught her eye once, and for the briefest second, her confidence flickered, a tiny crack in the mask. Because deep down, she must have known that I was not someone who would let this go. Over the next few days, she escalated her campaign of lies, telling anyone who would listen that I was careless, that maybe I had insurance motives, and even suggesting to some that the barn had been a hazard all along. A story that only made sense to those too timid to challenge her, but I had seen this type before. I had sentenced people just like her, manipulative and arrogant, always thinking their version of reality would win as long as they shouted loud enough. But sooner or later, facts always crushed falsehoods. I spent the following week in preparation, not just for the criminal case, but for the civil war I knew was about to erupt within the HOA. Because I could already sense which neighbors were tired of Karen's reign, which ones whispered behind closed doors about her abuses of power, and which ones secretly wished someone would finally stand up to her, and I intended to be that someone. In the evenings, I made phone calls, discreet ones. 2 contacts I still had in federal law enforcement. 2 colleagues who had sat beside me through some of the most grueling cases in recent memory. And though I was no longer on the bench, my reputation still carried weight. And when I explained that an HOA president had committed arson, there was no shortage of interest in ensuring the matter was handled properly. Because the law does not care how small the tyrant is, it only cares about justice. At the same time, Karen began to realize that perhaps she had gone too far. Because I noticed her shifting tactics, she started sending out HOA newsletters filled with forced cheer, pretending to be a benevolent leader, as though burning down a neighbor's barn was just a minor inconvenience best swept under the rug. And she even came to my door once with a fake smile, offering to help coordinate repairs to show the community's unity. But when I opened the door and looked at her without speaking, just letting the silence stretch, she grew visibly uncomfortable, her eyes darting away. And she muttered something about hoping I was doing all right before she quickly left. Because silence, as I had always known, is more powerful than words when you're dealing with the guilty. Still, Karen's pride was too great to back down completely, and soon she was holding emergency HOA meetings, claiming we needed to reassess community safety, pushing for new rules about barns, sheds and outbuildings, clearly designed to retroactively justify her actions. But this was where she miscalculated badly, because I attended that meeting, quietly sitting in the back as neighbors bickered. And when Karen tried to spin her narrative about how barns like mine were a danger, I stood, cleared my throat, and for the first time revealed who I was, Judge Alexander Kane. Retired but very much active in the pursuit of truth, and the entire room fell silent. I explained in measured, authoritative tones how the fire marshal had already determined the blaze was arson, how accelerant had been found, and how, in due time, evidence would come to light, proving exactly who was responsible. And as I spoke, Karen's face drained of color, because she knew exactly what I was referring to, though no one else did yet. The shift in the room was immediate. The murmurs began. Neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. And Karen stammered something about letting the investigation run its course, but the damage was done. Her aura of invincibility had cracked, and for the first time, people began openly questioning her authority. After that meeting, the neighborhood was never the same. Some people kept their distance from her. Others whispered about her late-night habits, and a few even came to me privately, sharing stories of how she had bullied them with fines, manipulated votes, and threatened retaliation if they dared oppose her. All of which I carefully documented because I knew this was no longer just about my barn. It was about uprooting a cancer in this community. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, I handed over the security footage to my contacts, ensuring it went straight into the hands of investigators who could not be bought or intimidated. And once that evidence was logged into the chain of custody, Karen's fate was sealed, though she didn't know it yet. In her desperation, she tried one last tactic, knocking on my door late at night with a trembling smile, saying maybe we could work this out privately. Maybe we didn't need to bring outside authorities into our community, but I simply looked at her, letting her squirm in the silence, and finally said, "The time for that passed when you lit the match," before closing the door in her face. And I could hear her footsteps retreat quickly down the driveway, her composure cracking under the weight of the truth closing in. That was the beginning of the end for Karen, though she would thrash and claw in the days to come, trying every trick in her arsenal. But what she didn't realize was that this wasn't a game anymore. It was a legal battle, and I had spent a lifetime mastering battles just like this. So as the investigation deepened and whispers of charges began to circle, I prepared myself for the storm that was about to break, knowing that when it did, Karen would learn exactly what it meant to pick a fight with the wrong man. The storm came sooner than anyone expected, because within a week of that fateful HOA meeting, investigators arrived in the neighborhood with quiet precision, interviewing residents, examining the remains of my barn, and discreetly collecting statements. And though no charges were filed immediately, word spread like wildfire that the fire marshal had officially ruled the blaze arson. And people began to look at Karen differently, no longer with the blind compliance she was used to, but with suspicion, fear, and in some cases, outright hostility. Because even the most submissive neighbors could not ignore the fact that someone in our midst had deliberately set fire to another's property. Karen tried desperately to spin the narrative, calling impromptu gatherings on her front lawn where she preached about unity and not jumping to conclusions, but the cracks were showing. And I could see her unraveling as her voice wavered and her hands shook. Whenever someone mentioned the word arson, I kept my composure, saying little, allowing the machinery of justice to grind forward at its own pace. Because I knew from experience that the guilty often destroy themselves more thoroughly when given the rope to hang their own credibility. During those days, I continued walking the neighborhood, greeting neighbors, offering calm reassurances, and listening as more and more of them opened up about their grievances with Karen. Stories of how she had fined a young couple for painting their shutters the wrong shade of blue, how she had berated an elderly man for leaving his trash cans out an hour too long, and how she had once threatened to sue a family for building a playset in their backyard. And the more I listened, the clearer it became that Karen's reign had been built not on respect, but on fear. And once fear was gone, she had nothing. At night, in the quiet of my study, I reviewed the footage again, making copies on encrypted drives, sending one to my contacts and keeping another locked away, because I knew Karen was desperate enough to try to destroy evidence if she ever got the chance. But this was not a criminal's world, where tampering went unnoticed. This was the real, meticulous process of law, and she was walking straight into its jaws. The first real sign of her desperation came when I discovered anonymous letters being slipped under neighbors' doors, claiming that I had staged the fire myself for insurance fraud, that I was manipulating the investigation. And even that I had a troubled past I was hiding. But those words carried little weight once people learned who I truly was. A federal judge who had spent a career dismantling liars, and more than one neighbor brought those letters directly to me. Shaking their heads at the pathetic attempt to deflect blame, Karen, however, did not stop there. She began patrolling the streets late at night, peeking into yards, jotting down notes on her clipboard, as if gathering ammunition against everyone. And though some neighbors were frightened, others began to whisper openly about removing her from the HOA board. Whispers that soon grew into serious discussions. The turning point came when the investigators requested a formal meeting with the HOA board to discuss the evidence they had gathered. And though Karen tried to frame it as a routine review, the truth quickly surfaced when they presented fragments of the melted gas can found near my barn and forensic traces that matched fuel purchased from a local hardware store. Fuel bought with a credit card belonging to none other than Karen herself. I watched the color drain from her face as those words were spoken, her voice faltering as she tried to insist there must be some mistake, that maybe her card had been stolen. But the investigators were calm, unyielding, stating that surveillance footage from the hardware store showed her at the register that same night, making the purchase. Gasps echoed around the room, and for the first time, Karen's grip on the board slipped completely, as even her loyal supporters avoided her eyes, unwilling to go down with a sinking ship. Still, the process was slow, and though she wasn't arrested that day, the noose was tightening, and I could see her desperation growing by the hour. In a last-ditch effort to save face, she tried to file a counter-complaint against me, claiming harassment, claiming I was using my past status as a judge to intimidate her. But when the officers reviewing her complaint learned about the security footage I had yet to reveal, they quietly informed her that such accusations could backfire into charges of false reporting. The walls were closing in, but Karen was nothing if not stubborn. And like so many criminals I had seen in court, she clung to her arrogance like a lifeline, refusing to admit defeat even as the evidence buried her. Meanwhile, the community began to change. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact with one another now spoke openly in small groups about taking back control, about rewriting HOA bylaws to prevent such unchecked power from ever concentrating in one person again. And I encouraged them gently, reminding them that justice was not just about punishing the guilty, but about repairing the damage done, about restoring balance. As the investigation continued, I received word from my contacts that charges were being prepared. And though I kept that information to myself for the moment, I walked the streets with a calm assurance that Karen could not match, because she knew in her bones that the end was coming. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in crimson light, she approached me in front of several neighbors, her voice raised, accusing me of orchestrating everything, of being the real villain, of using my status to ruin her life. But I stood silently, letting her rant, letting her words echo into the uncomfortable silence of those watching. And when she finally stopped, breathing heavily, I said only one thing: the truth has a way of burning brighter than lies. With that, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, trembling with rage and fear, and in that moment, everyone saw her not as a leader, but as what she truly was, a desperate woman cornered by her own actions. What Karen didn't realize was that her greatest mistake had not been lighting the match that destroyed my barn, but underestimating me, thinking I was just another retiree she could bully into submission. And now, as the evidence mounted and her support crumbled, she was about to learn the most painful lesson of all, that when you play with fire, eventually you get burned. The weeks that followed were a slow, methodical dismantling of Karen's world, and I watched it unfold with the same steady patience I had once used to preside over trials where men far more dangerous than her tried to wriggle free from the law, because I knew that arrogance always collapses under the weight of truth. And sure enough, Karen's facade began to fracture in ways she couldn't hide anymore. Her hair disheveled at HOA meetings, her voice strained as she barked out hollow commands, and her once proud strut reduced to hurried, jittery steps as though she could outrun the inevitable, but inevitability always catches up. Investigators returned with warrants this time, seizing her financial records, digging into HOA funds, and when whispers spread that money had gone missing under her watch, the community's anger swelled. Because it was one thing to bully neighbors with petty fines and threats, but another entirely to steal from the very people she claimed to serve. And even those who once defended her now muttered that she had gone too far. I didn't need to push anything. I let her own sins surface like bodies rising from a river, and each revelation chipped away at her crumbling power, till all that remained was a woman desperate to cling to scraps of control. She started coming to my property again, pacing near the ashes of the barn as though searching for some sign of weakness in me, but I gave her none, simply standing tall when I saw her, offering no words, because I knew silence was the loudest condemnation she could face. Meanwhile, my neighbors began organizing in earnest, drafting petitions to remove her from the board, rallying in living rooms and backyards, fueled not just by what she had done to me, but by years of pent-up resentment, and I guided them subtly, teaching them the principles of procedure and fairness. Because if we were to topple Karen, it had to be done with integrity, not vengeance. And in this way, the neighborhood transformed from a fearful, fragmented cluster of houses into something resembling a community again. Yet Karen, blind to reason, fought back with every ounce of spite she could muster, sending out letters dripping with venom, threatening lawsuits, claiming conspiracies, even accusing specific families of plotting against her. But each new outburst only further alienated her, isolating her until even her closest allies began to avoid her door. One evening, as I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, a young couple approached me, their hands trembling as they explained how Karen had fined them thousands for building a small deck without approval, nearly bankrupting them, and how they had stayed silent out of fear she'd retaliate further. And as they spoke, I saw the same story repeating over and over through the community, fear silencing justice, until someone finally stood up. I told them what I told everyone who came to me, that justice was coming, not because I willed it, but because truth has a gravity that cannot be denied forever. Behind the scenes, prosecutors were finalizing charges, and when I received confirmation that they were preparing to move forward with arson, fraud, and abuse of power, I knew the climax was near. Karen must have sensed it too, because her behavior grew more erratic. She confronted neighbors in the street, shouting accusations, trespassed onto properties under the guise of inspections, and even tried to intimidate the fire marshal by demanding he reconsider his findings. But each frantic move only tightened the net around her. The night before her arrest, I saw her standing across the road, staring at my property with a look that was equal parts hatred and desperation, her silhouette framed against the glow of streetlights. And I wondered if she realized then that her downfall was inevitable, that she had written her own sentence with fire. The next morning, unmarked cars rolled quietly into the neighborhood, and the calm professionalism of law enforcement unfolded as they approached her home, knocking firmly on her door, reading her rights as bewildered neighbors peeked from behind curtains. And though she tried to protest, tried to scream that it was all lies, the handcuffs clicked shut with finality, and the image of Karen being led away will forever be etched in the memory of this community. Some neighbors gasped, Others whispered prayers, and a few even clapped quietly, relieved that the reign of fear was finally over. But I did not celebrate. I simply watched, my face composed. Because this was not a moment for gloating, it was a moment of solemn truth. The conclusion of an arc I had seen play out countless times in courtrooms across the nation, pride destroying itself. After she was taken, the neighborhood felt different, lighter somehow, like a heavy curtain had been lifted, and in the days that followed, people came together to rebuild, offering me wood labor and supplies to reconstruct my barn gestures. I humbly accepted, not because I needed them, but because I wanted them to feel the strength of unity after years of division. I threw myself into the rebuilding project, hammer in hand, sweat on my brow, showing that no matter what was taken from me, I would rise again. And in doing so, others were inspired to make their own improvements, to take pride in their homes not out of fear of fines, but out of genuine love for their neighborhood. Still, Karen's shadow lingered, her trial looming. And though she sat in a jail cell awaiting her day in court, she remained defiant, filing motions, scribbling rants to anyone who would listen. But each attempt to wriggle free only dug her deeper into the pit she had created. When I was called to testify, I stood with calm certainty, presenting the security footage, the timeline, the evidence she could not escape, and as the jury watched her sneaking across my yard with that gas can, there was no denying the truth anymore, no narrative she could spin to erase what they saw with their own eyes. Her attorneys tried to paint her as misunderstood, as a woman overwhelmed by responsibilities, but the evidence was overwhelming. And when the verdict came down, guilty on multiple counts, the collective sigh of relief in that courtroom felt like a dam breaking. Karen collapsed into her chair, tears streaming down her face, finally stripped of the armor of arrogance she had worn for so long. And as she was led away to begin her sentence, I felt no triumph, only the steady affirmation that justice, once again, had done its work. Back in the neighborhood, life moved forward. Children played freely without her scolding eyes. Families decorated their homes without fear of fines, and laughter returned to streets once dominated by her scowls. And though the scars of her reign would take time to fade, the healing had begun. For me, the new barn rising from the ashes became more than just a structure. It was a symbol of resilience, of truth overcoming lies, of community overcoming tyranny. And every time I walked past its fresh timber and golden fields of corn swaying gently in the breeze, I was reminded that even in the face of destruction, there is always rebuilding, always renewal, always justice, waiting quietly for its moment to be revealed. Karen's conviction was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a long ripple effect that changed everything in our neighborhood, because when a tyrant finally falls, the echoes of their downfall reach far and wide, forcing everyone touched by their shadow to reevaluate how they had lived under it. And though Karen was locked away, her name became a stain whispered in disgust whenever the subject of HOAs came up, as neighbors who once feared her suddenly found their voices again, admitting how they had been manipulated and humiliated by her, and realizing they had allowed her to wield unchecked power for far too long. In the weeks following her sentencing, the community held meeting after meeting, this time filled not with threats or fines, but with genuine discussion. Because people wanted to rebuild not only their homes, but their sense of trust. And I sat quietly in the back at first, listening, until they eventually turned to me for guidance, asking how they could ensure that no one like Karen would ever rule over them again. I told them what I had told juries countless times before, that power without accountability breeds corruption, that silence in the face of injustice enables tyranny, and that it was their duty as a community to write rules that protected fairness rather than fear. And for once they listened not out of intimidation, but out of respect, because they had seen what unchecked arrogance could do when left to rot in the dark. Slowly, bylaws were rewritten, positions rotated, and the HOA board transformed from Karen's personal fiefdom into a balanced group of neighbors who actually cared about the well-being of the community. And though it wasn't perfect, nothing ever is. It was better, and it was real, and it was free. For me, the barn became a hub of restoration, rebuilt with the help of neighbors who volunteered their weekends to hammer nails and lift beams. Not because they owed me, but because they wanted to stand together. And every plank of wood carried not just sweat, but solidarity. Families brought food, children played in the fields, and for the first time since I had moved into this neighborhood, it felt alive, not smothered under Karen's iron grip, but breathing freely. Yet even as we rebuilt, reminders of her lingered. Because fear does not vanish overnight, and sometimes when the wind blew through the corn, I would catch neighbors glancing nervously toward the street where she had once strutted, as if half expecting her to appear again, clipboard in hand, barking out new rules. But I reassured them with steady words that she was gone, that justice had been served, and that their silence had been broken forever. In quieter moments, I reflected on what her downfall truly meant, not just for the community but for me, because when Karen burned down my barn, she thought she had destroyed my peace, but in reality, she reignited my purpose, reminding me why I had devoted my life to law and order, why I had sacrificed so much to uphold truth, and why I could never truly retire from the calling of justice. Because even in the most ordinary places, even in a quiet cul-de-sac, injustice can fester if left unchecked. That realization carried me forward, not with bitterness, but with clarity. And I used my experience to help neighbors resolve disputes fairly, to mediate conflicts before they grew into bitterness, and to teach them that justice does not always come in the form of police cars or courtrooms. Sometimes it comes in the form of people standing together, refusing to be afraid anymore. Over time, the neighborhood flourished in ways I never expected. Families planted gardens without fear of citations. Children chalked bright drawings on sidewalks without reprimand. And laughter rang out where once only Karen's scolding voice had been heard. And as the seasons turned and my new barn filled with golden rows of corn once again, I felt a deep sense of completion. As though the fire she set had burned away not just wood and grain, but the rot of fear that had poisoned this place. Of course, Karen's name still surfaced now and then. Sometimes in local news stories that followed her failed appeals. Sometimes in whispered jokes about the clipboard queen who went too far. But her power was gone, her influence destroyed. And she remained nothing more than a cautionary tale of arrogance meeting consequences. I thought often about the moment I revealed my identity to her, when she realized she hadn't just targeted a retiree with a barn, but a federal judge who had spent his life dismantling egos much bigger than hers. And I wondered if, in those final moments of freedom, she regretted what she had done, or if her pride was too strong to allow even that. But it didn't matter anymore, because regret or not, she would spend years behind bars, reflecting on the cost of her choices. As for me, I walk the streets with a quiet pride, not in her downfall, but in the community's rebirth. Knowing that when they looked at me, they didn't just see a man with a rebuilt barn. They saw the proof that even the most feared bully could be brought to justice if someone stood up. And that knowledge gave them courage, the kind of courage that lasts long after scars have healed. And so the neighborhood changed. Not overnight, not completely, but enough to matter. Enough to remind us all that justice, though sometimes slow, always arrives, and that when it does, it leaves behind not just punishment, but renewal. Yet, even as life returned to normal, I kept one truth close at heart. There will always be another Karen somewhere. Another person who thinks they can bend others to their will. Another petty tyrant who mistakes fear for respect. And when that happens, it will once again fall on someone. Somewhere to stand up and say, enough. The barn stands tall now, its walls strong, its roof gleaming in the sun, and every time I walk past it, I am reminded not of the fire that destroyed it, but of the justice that rose from its ashes. Proof that no matter how dark the night, the dawn always comes. And those who dare to believe they are untouchable will eventually face the truth they tried so hard to escape. The final confrontation with Karen came faster than even I anticipated. Because once federal agents formally opened their investigation into the arson, the HOA's corruption, and the mounting list of intimidation tactics, word spread like wildfire across the community. And though many residents quietly cheered, Karen herself unraveled in full view, becoming more desperate by the day. Clinging to her fragile illusion of power as though screaming louder, might undo the inevitable? And it all reached its peak during what would become the last HOA meeting she ever presided over, where she strutted in with her usual air of arrogance, but looked almost manic, her eyes darting from neighbor to neighbor as though everyone was a potential traitor. And when the floor opened for complaints, residents unleashed years of pent-up anger, one after another rising to tell their stories of harassment, of extortionate fines, of surveillance cameras Karen had forced upon them under the guise of security, but used instead to pry into their private lives. And she tried to shout them down, slamming her gavel and threatening legal action. But her voice cracked with panic, and just when the chaos reached its boiling point, the doors opened and 2 federal marshals walked in, accompanied by a U.S. attorney, and the room fell silent except for Karen, who immediately erupted into shrill protests, accusing me of conspiring against her, screaming that the neighborhood would collapse without her control, that she was the only one who cared about standards. But her tirade was cut short when the marshals stepped forward and announced that she was under arrest for multiple federal charges, including arson, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. And in that moment, the once feared Karen, who had terrorized the community for years, was reduced to a trembling figure dragged away in handcuffs as neighbors watched in stunned silence, some gasping, others whispering, and a few even clapping quietly as justice was finally served before their very eyes. But the story didn't end there, because as the investigation continued, more board members were implicated, their signatures found on fraudulent invoices, their names linked to embezzled HOA funds. And within months, the entire board was dissolved, replaced by a temporary oversight committee until fair elections could be held, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood began to breathe again. Lawns grew without fear of fines. Kids' chalk drawings were no longer scrubbed away by order, and the oppressive shadow Karen had cast began to lift. Though the scars of her reign lingered in memories and in the blackened remains of my barn, which I deliberately left standing as a reminder of what unchecked arrogance and cruelty could lead to. In the months that followed, I used my connections not to elevate myself, but to ensure the neighborhood was given resources to rebuild properly, securing grants for community improvement and helping to establish bylaws that would forever prevent another Karen from seizing power the way she had. And as for me, I took quiet satisfaction in knowing that when the moment came, I had not needed to reveal my title as a federal judge until it mattered most, that the truth of who I was and the power behind my position had struck fear into those who believed themselves untouchable. And though some residents looked at me differently now, with newfound respect, tinged with awe, I remained the same man I had always been, someone who valued justice above ego, someone who believed in the law, not as a weapon, but as a shield for those who needed it most. And when Karen's trial finally came, I did not preside over a conflict of interest forbade that, but I did sit in the gallery, watching as the jury heard the evidence, and I saw in her eyes the dawning realization that no lie, no tantrum, no desperate accusation could save her. And when the guilty verdict was read, it was not just a legal decision, but a communal catharsis, a moment of collective healing that belonged to every neighbor who had ever felt her wrath. And though she was sentenced to years in federal prison, the real punishment was that she had lost the one thing she craved most: control. And as the marshals led her away for the last time, her legacy was not one of authority or order, but of shame and ruin. Afterward, as the neighborhood began to thrive under new leadership, I rebuilt my barn, not as a place for crops, but as a community gathering hall, a place where neighbors could come together to celebrate, to discuss, to rebuild the trust that Karen had shattered. And when we held the first harvest festival there, children running through the fields, laughter echoing against the beams, I felt a sense of closure, a reminder that even the darkest chapters could give way to brighter ones. And yet, as I stood at the edge of the crowd watching the sun set over the golden stalks, I couldn't help but feel a quiet vigilance, because for every Karen who fell, there were always others waiting in the wings. People who believed rules were tools for domination rather than fairness. And I knew that as long as I lived in that community, I would stand guard against them, ready to protect my neighbors, my home, and my values. because justice was not just something I practiced in the courtroom, it was something I lived. Every single day. And I wanted everyone who ever tried to abuse power to know that somewhere, someone was watching, someone unafraid to hold them accountable. And so, the story of Karen's downfall became a cautionary tale passed from one neighbor to another. A reminder of what happens when hubris collides with law. When fire is met with steel, and though peace had returned, the echoes of her scream the day she was dragged away still haunted the meeting hall. A testament to the truth that no matter how powerful someone believes themselves to be, there is always a reckoning. And if you want more stories of HOA Karens, justice served, and dramatic showdowns where arrogance meets its match, then don't miss what's coming next. Make sure you subscribe to Sham Stories right now, because the next tale will be even wilder, and you won't want to miss a second of it. The aftermath of Karen's bold but disastrous move against my corn barn was still unraveling. But by now, the shock had begun to wear off in the neighborhood, and the true consequences were setting in. Not just for her, but for the entire HOA board that had backed her silently or turned a blind eye while she carried out her reckless vendetta. And the deeper I dug, the more I realized this was not simply a matter of a nosy neighbor gone too far, but rather an entire culture of corruption and arrogance within the HOA leadership that believed they could act without consequence against whoever they chose. Whether by intimidation, harassment, or destruction of property. And this was the part where my judicial instincts refused to sit idle any longer, because I had spent a lifetime on the bench punishing those who thought they were above the law. And I would be damned if I allowed these petty tyrants to treat me or anyone else that way. So I quietly began to build my case in earnest, assembling files, screenshots, testimonies, and surveillance footage into a meticulous record of every violation they had committed, every bribe that had been whispered about, every threat they had made against residents who dared to stand up to them. And I took great care to keep my work discreet, cloaking it in the same calm mask I wore in court, even as behind the scenes I was steadily constructing the most ironclad legal assault they would ever face. One that would not only implicate Karen for arson, but also tie in her fellow board members who had been complicit by ignoring the mounting complaints against her. And while all of this was happening, Karen herself had not stopped her antics but rather doubled down in her desperation, convinced that she could somehow salvage her reputation and position by portraying herself as the victim of a witch hunt, posting rants online about me, about so-called abuses of power, about imagined conspiracies against her. And though many in the neighborhood laughed at her attempts to flip the narrative, a few loyal followers of hers continued to whisper support, showing up at meetings to back her up. And it reminded me of countless defendants I had seen over the years who clung to delusion even as the walls closed in. Because sometimes it was easier for them to believe in their own lies than to face the truth that they had gone too far. Now, Karen was nothing if not stubborn. But what she failed to realize was that her latest move, tempting to smear my name and question my position as a judge, was the final mistake that sealed her fate. Because the moment she began trying to interfere with my role on the bench, she had crossed a threshold that put her actions squarely in the realm of obstruction of justice, and that was no longer a neighborhood issue, but a federal one. I remember one particular evening when I sat on my porch reviewing documents under the dim porch light, the sound of crickets humming around me, when my phone buzzed with a message from a longtime colleague in the U.S. Attorney's Office, someone who had caught wind of what had happened to my property. And he told me in no uncertain terms that if I wanted to bring formal charges, they would back me with the full force of the federal system. Because burning down the property of a sitting federal judge was not something that could be dismissed as a local dispute. It was a direct threat to the judiciary itself. And hearing that gave me a sense of finality, like the last piece of a puzzle sliding into place, because now I knew Karen wasn't just facing the consequences of her actions at a community level, but rather a storm far larger than she had ever anticipated. And even so, I resolved to let the process play out in due time, because timing mattered and I wanted the full scope of her wrongdoing laid bare before everyone. Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood grew tense. with residents whispering more openly about their fears, about the absurdity of the HOA rules that had ballooned under Karen's reign, about the special fees she had pushed through under suspicious circumstances, and about the sense of relief they might feel if someone finally brought her in her circle down. And more people began quietly approaching me, slipping me documents or recounting stories of threats she had made, with one neighbor even confessing that Karen had once demanded she'd tear down her child's treehouse under the pretense of visual uniformity while threatening to fine her $500 a week if she refused. And another revealed that he had caught Karen rifling through his mail, though he had been too intimidated to report it at the time, but now, emboldened by the fact that I was standing firm against her. People were willing to speak up, and with every new testimony my file grew thicker, until I knew I could not only press charges for arson, but expose years of abusive behavior. Still, Karen carried herself with false confidence, attending board meetings as though nothing had changed, barking at residents about lawn height or mailbox paint while pretending that the blackened skeleton of my barn was not a permanent monument to her crimes. But beneath the surface, her composure was cracking, and I saw it in the way her hands trembled when she tried to wield authority, or how her voice wavered when residents now openly challenged her instead of cowering. And the truth was spreading faster than she could contain it, which only fueled her paranoia, leading her to hire a private investigator to follow me, as if digging into my personal life could give her some leverage. But that too backfired, because the investigator quickly realized who I was, and rather than risking his license, he turned the whole matter over to the authorities, reporting Karen for attempted witness intimidation, and by then the dominoes were falling in rapid succession, each misstep of hers accelerating her downfall. And though I had not yet revealed my hand fully, the web of consequences she had spun was tightening around her throat. Yet even with the inevitability of her fate looming, I couldn't shake the unease of knowing she was still unpredictable, still capable of one more rash move that might endanger someone else, because people like her rarely went quietly. And as I closed my files late one night and looked out over the quiet fields where my barn once stood, I knew the endgame was approaching, and it would be messy, dramatic, and utterly decisive, because there was no way Karen was going to surrender without a fight. And I was more than ready to meet her in that arena when the moment came.